Okay, good day to a students. I hope everything is going well. So this is just a revision video quickly on chapter 6, which is the financial markets part 2. I'm just going to take you through some of the slides and just explain some of the concepts in more detail. So just to see the outline, so we're going to look at nominal versus real interest rates. We're also going to look at the risk and risk premium, and we're going to look at the role of financial intermediaries, and then we're going to also extend that to the ISLM model. Okay, so just quickly, up until now, what you've studied. So up until now, you've focused really on the previous chapters, which looked at there's only two interest rates to consider because there's only really two assets to consider. So you think about it, if you're an investor, the previous chapters assume that the investor has two choices. Either they put their money in money or they put their money in bonds. Okay, so you either put your wealth in money or you put it in bonds, and the big thing here is to think about interest. So what interest it earns, because we know money earns almost zero interest compared to keeping your money in riskier bonds. So that's all that the investor needs to think about. And now what we do is we expand on that and we say, okay, let's expand and say, okay, let's say there's more than one interest, because we obviously know there's more than one bond, so there's obviously also more than one interest rate that investors need to consider. And now we're going to build up a bit our model. Specifically, we're going to look at nominal and real interest rates, and then we're going to build a model from here. Okay. And then we're going to look at the role that plays in the economy and also the macroeconomic implications of that in the ISLM model. But essentially what you need to understand now is we're going to build the model up to say we're not only looking at just the two financial assets like money and bonds, we're thinking about it differently now in terms of we know there's different bonds, so there should also be different interest rates, which drives investment choices. Okay. Sorry for the coughing, I'm a bit sick today, but at least you can't catch it from me because I'm far away. So, but apologies if I have to take a break once or twice because my voice is not as it was. Okay, so let's just take you through some of these interest rates. The first one is the nominal interest rate and then a real interest rate. Now, what is a nominal and real? What's the difference between the two? The nominal is essentially the interest rate you normally see in the news. So that's the interest rate that the government will report, or Reserve Bank will report, or which one you'll see in a bond. Like, let's say a bond gives you 6% interest. That is what you see. Or you buy a house or a car and you have to pay 10% interest on that house or car loan you took from ABSA. That is the nominal. The real interest rate, however, is actually in terms of your buying power or a basket of goods. And that's the more important one to consider. And the real reason behind that is quite simple. If you think about it, let's say, for instance, I invest some money in a bond, and they say I get an interest of, let's say, 10%, which gives me 1,000 Rand a month or 1,000 Rand a year on that bond. Now I'm saying, okay, well, at least that bond is growing, I'm getting some money back on it. But now let's say inflation is actually increasing so fast that it's rising more than 1,000 Rand a year. Increase in prices. Now that is a problem, because now, although your nominal interest, so you're earning interest on a bond, but actually the inflation is even worse than the interest payment you're getting, or the interest return you're getting, and that will actually lead to a lower position in your welfare. Okay, so that's why we need to consider the buying power of your interest. Okay, so you don't consider it in terms of interest, you consider it in terms of the buying power of the interest that you earn. And that is from earning point of view. And from paying point of view, it's quite similar. And that's what I want to take you through with this model here, because essentially what we're looking at here is we're not looking at really the Rand return of an investment, but rather the good return of an investment. Meaning you want to, let's say you borrow a basket of goods now, you want to see, okay, when I repay these baskets, is it going to be the same? And that is what I want to explain here with this one good model. Okay, so let's just consider the bread. And let's say and take an example. Let's say you go and you borrow money from a friend to buy bread. Let's say that is 10 Rand. You go and you borrow 10 Rand to buy some bread. Now, let's say a loaf of bread is equal to 1 Rand. So how many loaves of bread can you buy? 10 Rand, 1 Rand a loaf of bread. That's quite hypothetical, but let's just keep with that. Then that's 10 loaves of bread that you can buy with the 10 Rand. Okay. Okay, and that's quite important. And you borrow that money, remember? Now, you need to go and repay your friend. So you go and you take the one good, which is the breads you bought. In rand terms, you borrowed 10 rand. You need to pay your friend the 10 rand plus maybe some interest. If it's not a good friend, he's probably going to charge you some interest. And then you need to work something out here. And that is what we need to look at here, is what you need to look at to understand why we consider this very important, is the top part minus the bottom part. Now the bottom part is the expected price of bread, and then the top part is the expected repayment that you'll have to make. Let's keep that constant as 10 rand. So you don't pay any interest on in this case. You just borrow 10 rand from a friend, you pay them 10 rand back. That's the top part, divided by the price of bread. Now let's say, for instance, the price of bread goes up to 2 rand. Then it's 10 divided by 2, that is equal to 5. Now, very importantly, can you see what happened here? You borrowed 10 rand from a friend, you bought 10 loaves of bread. You then paid the friend back over a year the 10 rand, and now the price of bread is 2 rand. So now the friend can take that 10 rand, but they can only pay 5 loaves of bread. So you, as the person who borrowed money, actually gained from the fact that prices increased, because you could have, the 10 rand bought you 10 loaves of bread, but now you give the same 10 rand back to the friend, but it only gives him 5 loaves of bread. You understand? That is the most important part, is to understand that these price changes actually deflate the position of the person who extended the loan, essentially. You understand? And that's very important to just grasp. Now, again, that is what this relationship shows here. And that really then is our real rate that we want to understand, because it shows us our nominal interest rates, which is I, divided by our expected price times our current price level. And again, so you have three components here, and it's not really that important to understand deriving this formula, but more important just to understand the components here. Is you have your real return or real interest rates, you have your nominal interest rates, and you have your price level. The three components we're going to use to derive the most important formula in chapter 6. Okay, so let's just go to expand on this. So again, you can just rewrite the formulas that has been explained here. Again, it's not too much in detail that you have to understand this. It's more about understanding the fact of the example where you know that you're going to make money from this, because now the 10 rand you borrowed is worth less money when you have to pay it back because of the inflation. And interest the same. And we'll talk about interest as we go along. But what you can do is you can rearrange these formulas. Essentially, what you can get to is this formula here. That is one of the more important formulas in the chapter 6, where you have your real interest rates as here. You have your nominal interest rates divided by the expected inflation. Okay, which is T plus 1, meaning expected inflation. Okay, and then what we can do is we can approximate this to get to our really important formula, to say this is a simplified version, but it's quite powerful in economics, to say that real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rates minus the expected level of inflation. And the reason why we can say it like this is because we know that there's not a lot of shifts between these variables over time. So that's why we can approximate this equation here, 6.3 to 6.4, which is the vital equation in economics, especially relating to interest rates. Okay. So what are some of the conditions of this formula? Firstly is that if your expected inflation rate is going to be equal to 0, then your nominal interest rate here will be equal to your real interest rate. Okay, that's the first one. Because expected inflation is typically positive, meaning this value is normally positive, so it's always -1 or -2, -5, whatever, because inflation is always above 0 or normally above 0, then that will lead to your real interest rate being higher than your nominal interest rate. Or sorry, lower than your nominal interest rate. Sorry, mistake there. It's actually lower than your nominal interest rate is your real interest rate. Okay, and then very importantly, what can the policymakers now do? They will now target a certain level of the nominal interest rates in order to get a desired level of the real interest rate given a certain price level in the economy. So if they say inflation is let's say inflation in currently South Africa is 7%, then they will say, okay, what do we need to do to this IT to get our real interest rate at a certain level, like let's say 3%? Okay, so if our inflation rate is 7%, we want to get this to 3%, then we need to make our nominal interest rate 10%, because 10 minus the 7 will give us 3, and the real interest rate is really what investors want to look at, because investors don't care about a nominal interest rate as much, because again, nominal interest rate does not tell us price changes, so it doesn't incorporate price changes, where the real interest rate tells us, okay, this is the interest we're going to get on our loan or on our bond, but we also know that the price changes have already been reflected in this real interest rate, meaning we're going to get a solid 3% out, or even after we've removed the impact of inflation. Because what do you want to do as an investor? Just to say it in simple words, if I get R1,000 interest repayment on a bond and the inflation per year is 900, then I know at least every year my bond is going to go up in real terms by R100. You understand? Because the bond return is higher than the inflation. But once the inflation goes to 1,200, then every year I'm going to lose out minus 300 on my bond, because it's getting less and less and less. So my interest payment here needs to be quite high, and that's the real interest payment you want to, this one, the real interest payment. Okay, just to think about it in general sense. Okay, so now we can expand on this, and we can maybe use a few examples. So one thing we can need to note is that this nominal interest rate can never go below 0, because we studied in the previous chapters, if it goes below 0, then that will disincentivize people to hold bonds. So your nominal interest rates needs to be above 0 always, so it can never go into the negative. So if the condition is that this one always needs to be 0, then the highest the real interest rates can be is the lowest the real interest rate can be is the negative of the inflation. Okay, and that's quite important just to understand. And we'll look at an example like that just now. But let's take this example here. If your real nominal interest rate is 0% and inflation is -1 or 1%, not -1, sorry, it's just 1%, but in the formula then it's -1. So then your real interest rate can be, the lowest it can go is -1%. The problem that we have here is we already see an issue of the 0 lower bound that we have an issue with. Is, let's say for instance you have a situation of deflation where your interest rate is actually, it's -1, but your interest rate is actually -1, meaning there's deflation. Now then it's +1, and that is the lowest your real interest rate can go is +1. And that's quite important, because then we see that the Reserve Bank won't be able to get your real interest rate below 1%, which might not be enough to improve spending. So they might not have enough room to improve spending, and we'll talk about that as we move along in this section. But if you want to go and replace some values in and see if you can understand it better with your own numerical values. The real interest rate is based on expected inflation. It's sometimes called the before fact real interest. The realized real interest is called post fact, after the fact interest. Okay, and that's just to understand, one is based on the expectations one, and one is based on the current level of inflation. Just a theoretical note there. Okay, what we really want to do now is to build it into our IS relation, so that's what we're going to do a little bit later on. But again, like I said, a 0 lower bound of nominal interest rate implies that a real interest rate cannot be lower than a negative of inflation. Again, let me just write it like this. So real is equal to nominal minus the inflation. Okay, that is the formula. Now, if the inflation is actually deflation, meaning it's -5%, okay, let's say the nominal interest rate is quite low in this economy at 0%. So what is your real interest going to be? So then it's 0 minus -5. So the real interest rate is going to be equal to +5. That is the lowest the Reserve Bank will be able to get a real interest. And again, we know from economics, how do they promote economic growth for spending in the economy? they reduce the interest rate. And if they can't reduce it below 5%, that might not incentivize consumers and companies to spend and loan more money, because loans are still expensive. So what will happen is they will not have a big impact, as what happened in the financial crisis. When the nominal interest rates were quite low, the inflation was not too high, but it was still not great. The fact is the inflation rate was quite low, and that meant that the Reserve Bank did not have a lot of room in order to really implement their policy. There wasn't really deflation, but the inflation rate was quite low, which meant that it couldn't really get it below a certain level for them to incentivize more spending, and that's why they had to use quantitative easing. Okay, so that's just the explanation behind the zero lower bound. You can look at this graph here to show you the nominal and real interest rates. As you can see, a nominal is always above the real, especially given there's always a condition of inflation, or in most cases there's inflation. So that's why nominal will always be higher than your real, because real is just nominal minus the inflation. And that is technically just a summary on your nominal and the real interest rates. Before I put that in the ISLM model, I just want to take you now through the risk premium, and then we're going to just cover this in a brief session. Okay, so now, given we know real and nominal interest rates, let's also think about bonds in terms of their riskiness. We know some bonds are riskier than others, like let's say a government bond and a corporate bond. A corporate bond has a higher chance of defaulting because it's a corporate company compared to maybe a government, which are sometimes risk-free. Now, it's important then to understand what attracts investors to hold riskier bonds, and we call that a risk premium. So if you want people to hold your risky bond, you need to give them a higher premium, which is just an addition on the interest you're already giving them. So if I give them 5%, I will give them a risk premium of 2%, meaning they're going to get 7% return on the bond. So the risk premium of 2% will be added on the interest. Okay. For me, that is quite extensive to understand. You can also go through the mathematical formulas here, but again, the mathematical formulas try to paint the same picture just a bit more differently in terms of the mathematics behind it, looking at a P as a probability of defaulting, and then looking at how high your risk premium needs to be, giving a certain level of interest and how risky the bond is. So this value here just shows us what is the probability of defaulting, which will then increase the risk premium. Okay, but important just to understand the concept of risk premium is as it will add to your real interest rate or your interest rate. Okay. Some bonds are risky, so bondholders require risk premium. Risk premium are determined by the probability of default, like I said, and the degree of risk aversion of these bondholders. So maybe your society does not want to hold a lot of risky bonds because of uncertain times, then you will have to increase your risk premium to help them hold these bonds. Okay, we can also go through some of these graphs to show you just the different risk premiums in terms of corporate bonds versus government bonds. As I say, corporate bonds normally have higher risk premiums compared to government bonds, which have a lower chance of defaulting. Oh, sorry for that. So let's now move on and look at the role of financial intermediaries. So until now, we've looked at direct finance, borrowing directly by ultimate borrowers and from ultimate lenders. So we haven't looked at a financial intermediary, which is the banks. It's important when you look at interest rates like nominal and real interest rates and the risk premium to understand the role of banks and the role of a financial intermediary. Much of the borrowing and lending takes place through these financial intermediaries. They're financial institutions that receive funds from investors and then lend these funds out to others. One important distinction just to make in terms of a bank is to look at a bank balance sheet, which is really what caused the financial crisis in 2008. So what you have here is, if you look at a bank's assets, think about what is an asset for a bank, what is a liability for a bank. If I'm a bank, then a liability for me is the deposits that people put in my bank. So let's say I'm ABSA and people come and deposit money into their ABSA account. ABSA owes that person money because it keeps their money for them. So you actually see that as a liability on your balance sheet as a bank. And then what you do is you then extend loans, which you can then see as assets. So if you're a normal profit-driven company, what is your main aim? Expand your assets to expand your business. So what will firms or banks try to do? They'll try to extend as many loans as possible because to improve their assets. But what happened in the '08 crisis? Banks extended a lot of riskier loans that had a large chance of defaulting. These loans started to default, and the bank's assets started to drop. And once the bank's assets drops below its liabilities, then technically you're declared insolvent as a firm. And that's what happened to a bank in the USA, which caused bank runs and panic in the system. But really, that is what happened. And you can read the last section on this chapter if you want to for more interesting theories or facts about the housing crisis and financial crisis. But again, that is, in short, a 30-second summary of how the financial crisis came to be. Is the fact that these loans that banks extended to the housing loans, they extended the first ones they extended was to solid credit score individuals, but then as they extended more and more loans, it became high chance of defaulting because they started to extend to more riskier or lower credit score individuals. And then as those defaulted, their assets dropped below their liabilities and they declared bankruptcy, one of the banks, and then that caused a massive bank run and panic. So what do banks then, or the financial system, do to counter this? They say, okay, you need to keep a certain amount of your capital, which is retained earnings and shares and bonds of a bank. They need to keep a certain amount in proportion to their assets to cover for any asset loss. So if you reduce your assets by 20, then your capital needs to cover this so that it doesn't fall below the liabilities. And we use the capital ratio, which is ratio of capital to assets. So then you just take your capital divided by your assets value, and in your leverage ratio, which is ratio of assets to capital, which is just the other way around. Both of these again tell us how really not really how risky this bank is to become insolvent, which is a major thing for financial stability, to make sure banks have enough capital. And that's what the Basel Accords are based on, is a macroprudential policy, is trying to make sure that these capital amounts are high enough to cover any asset losses, okay, so the bank doesn't becomes insolvent. Then you also have it from the other side, is in terms of liquidity and liability. So if you think about it, if I deposit money into ABSA, that is a liability for ABSA because I want to get that money out sometime. Now, if there's panic in the system and I see one bank closing in my country, I will rush to my own bank and demand all my money out of there because I want to keep it under my mattress where it's safe. And that will cause huge bank runs, which banks don't always have enough liquidity to give the people their deposits back. That's why they give some secure deposits or deposit insurance to tell them deposits are safe. And this can also lead to fire sale prices, where they have to sell some of their bonds to quickly get liquidity. So liquidity is also a big issue. So you don't just have the asset issue, you also have the liquidity issue when you look at the banks. In terms of the riskiness, okay, and that's just good to understand when you think about interest rates and risk premium. You can go and read this section on the bank runs, how it works. But again, like I said, that example of me going to get my money out is just a good example of that. But please just go and read through these focus points. Okay, now I'm going to go to the last section of this chapter, which is extending everything to the ISLM model to see how you can really apply this practically to the ISLM model. Now we're going to extend the ISLM model by introducing the nominal and real interest rates. Previously, we've just looked at one interest rate, which was the nominal interest rate. And then we're also going to look at a policy rate set by central banks and an interest rate fixed by borrowers. Okay. So if you look at the IS-LM relation, the most important one here is the LM relation stays the same. Now, what is this I? That's the nominal interest rate. So the LM works on the nominal interest rates, where the IS works on the real interest rates, where it's nominal minus the expected inflation and then your risk premium. So that's the key points we add here, is on our IS relation, we add the real interest rate here and the risk premium, which we add as a positive sign here. And we need to understand that we add it here to the investment function, but we also need to understand what will happen if these values change with our investment, with our IS relation, and that's what we're going to look at just now. Okay. Before we do that, let's just think about the central bank and why they would now look at the nominal interest rate in order to change the real interest rate. Because again, that is centrally what we want to do is, as a central bank, like I said in this previous with this equation, the central bank would want to choose a nominal interest rate, like a repo rate, that will set in motion a good condition where your real interest rate will then be equal to the desired target. So like I said, let's say for instance you want to get your interest rate to, what did I say here? Sorry, let me just go back to this equation here. Let's say for instance the South African Reserve Bank, SRB, wants real interest rates, which is the most important one because those are the ones investors make their choices on, is a real interest rate. They want that equal to 3%. Currently inflation in South Africa is 10%. Well, no, sorry, 7%. So let's say they expect it to be 7%. It's currently, let's say, it's around 6.9, expected to be 7% maybe next year because of something happening in the economy. Now, what level of nominal interest rates do they need to achieve the 3%? So now it's about replacing it in the formula, saying, okay, now I minus 7%, so this needs to be then 10%. So they need to then have the prime rate or the policy rate, let's call it a policy rate as they do in the slides. They need to have the policy rate equal to 10%. As you can see here. So that is the R, that is their policy rate, in order to get the desired level of real interest rate, okay, which is 3%. So just understand that concept, that they will then target the nominal interest rate in order to achieve the real interest rate, which is the one that is important in your output model, not the policy rate. So the policy rate is not important in your IS relation. The policy rate is important here to influence the real interest rate, which is important in your policy relation, and then plus the risk premium. Okay, so again, in order for investors to hold bonds, they will need a real interest rate of 3% plus maybe a risk premium of 2%, which is a 5% then. So that's why we say plus the risk premium, which is X. Okay, but that's really the relation. Now let's go here and look at the first case study. Let's look at an increase in the risk premium. If the risk premium increases, what will happen is, remember what happens here is if the risk premium increases, then what will happen is if the risk premium increases, it will lead to an increase in the interest rates, okay? Because again, think about what a risk premium is. A risk premium tells us this is the value additionally to the interest that we need to take on a riskier bond. Now, if that risk premium goes up, the whole interest burden becomes higher, okay? So that will reduce investments and also reduce output, okay? So that's quite important to understand. Now, if that happens, what will happen now is the Reserve Bank will say, okay, how can we now go back to our level here? So let's say what happened here was an increase in the risk premium, shifted the IS curve to the left. But now the Reserve Bank will come and say, okay, what does our policy rate need to be in order to get back to our full employment level? Because that's all you want to do, is you want to go back to the initial level of output, because you don't want to stay here as a Reserve Bank. So what you want to do is then you need to determine, okay, by how much now do I need to decrease maybe the policy rate in order to get back to this level, okay? And that's what we see here. So if significantly large, a decrease in the policy rate can in principle offset the increase in the risk premium. The zero bound, however, may however put a limit on a decrease in the policy rate, okay? In terms of, again, if you don't really have the room to decrease the real interest rates, then you're going to, or the policy rate, then you're going to have a problem. Like, let's say inflation is 10%. How much can the SRB reduce the interest rates by? Then we know they can reduce it by 10%, okay? But If the inflation is only 1%, then what will happen is the lowest they can go with the real rate is minus 1%, which might not be enough to offset it. Okay, in this case, it is enough. They need to go below zero in order to get it back to its equilibrium level. But in other cases, they might not have enough room, and then they'll end up at this point here. So let's say, for example, I just want to give you an example here. Let's say there was deflation in the economy, meaning inflation was minus 1%. Okay, how much can a reserve bank reduce the real interest rate by? Remember, if we say minus 1 times minus, then that's a plus. So then the lowest they can go with the real interest is plus 1%, which is above here. And if you draw your IS line above here, then that is the furthest you can go back to your original output level. So you settle at a point here. So you can't really offset the increase in the risk premium if you don't have enough room. Similarly apply if your inflation rate is minus 1%, let's say it's 1%, then again, this is now 1%, so yes, it's minus 1, but that's maybe not enough, and it might just be here. Again, you're not going to really offset it back to its original point. So you need room. That's the whole point here in your model. How do you have more room? If you have high inflation, you have probably more room to change your interest rates. So high inflation would lead to more room to play around. But what happened in the 2008 crisis, inflation was quite low, nominal interest rates were quite low, so the Reserve Bank did not have enough room to actually offset a crisis issue. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Let me see if I can finish at least. The housing price, you can go and read through. Again, it's a nice background study about how really the financial crisis worked. You can go through these. I just want to take you through this one again. So what happens in our another case study here is where we say the Reserve Bank currently, let's say the current Reserve Bank in South Africa, they increase the repo rate. Okay, which is this policy rate. And if they increase this repo rate, what will happen is then it will lead to a shift up of this model, which will again decrease. Okay, so that's just in case of a restrictive monetary policy like the one South Africa is currently implementing. Okay, so that's just also to understand it from that point of view. But for me, one of the most important things to understand, and I'll just summarize it here, is to say, the risk premium. Okay, now risk premium, which is X, okay, that is tied to your real interest. So your real interest rate plus your X, your risk premium, that is really what investors consider, consumers and investors consider. If this risk premium goes up and it increases, then this whole equation here increases, and that will lead to a lower demand for loans and investments, because now it's more expensive to take out loans and investments, and that will lead into a lower IS curve, or shift of the IS curve to the left-hand side, which will lower the output level. And then the only way the Reserve Bank can come in and offset this change is to say, okay, but by how much do we need to now lower the interest rates, the policy rate, which will affect the real interest rate? And that is what I will say, and that will be based on the current inflation and the current nominal interest rates in the economy, because that will tell them how much room they have to actually lower it. And again, like I said, when your nominal interest rate is equal to zero, then normally you don't have a lot of room, because then the lowest you can go is negative your inflation. And if your inflation is not high, then the lowest you can go is -1, which might not be enough. In this case, it's maybe -2 that I needed to offset, and that is what happened here. So just use the values to understand the concept. But in this graph here, there is a complete offset, meaning the lower policy rate completely offsets the higher risk premium, as you can see, and that is what policymakers are trying to do in a monetary sense. Thank you very much. The rest of the slides you can go through. It's just quite interesting to understand the housing price. You can read through these just as a some interesting facts, maybe for some short answer questions, and then yeah, the last one here is quite interesting, just to show you exactly what happened in financial crisis was. And I'll end off with this graph here, is the fact that we started here at point A, then because of the major shift in the financial crisis, our IS curve shifted completely to the left-hand side to point B. At point B, our output was very low, meaning unemployment was very high, and now policy had to be implemented. The first one that was implemented was to, okay, say, let us reduce our interest rates, as you can see here, but because of the lower bound issue, we couldn't reduce it further than this point, so then the fiscal policy had to step in and then to promote spending, and that moved the IS curve to the right hand side. But still, we weren't at our exact position back at equilibrium. So again, even both policies, fiscal and monetary policy, sometimes are not strong enough to, or doesn't have enough room, let's say it like that, to really get you back to your full employment level before the crisis. Okay. The real data will show you we're probably way beyond that point, but this is just for interesting sake in terms of understanding policy mixes in terms of fiscal and monetary policy being implemented at the same time and not delivering the results as expected or get you back to your original point before the shock. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you understand that. If I were you, please go and watch this video in detail. And well, you've watched it now in detail, but if you need to rewatch some sections, please go and rewatch and understand really the difference between nominal and real interest rates. Understand that equation about real, nominal, and expected inflation, risk premium, the role of a financial intermediary, the leverage ratio, capital ratio, and then also the extension on the ISLM graphs. Thank you very much.